Hi, my name is Kim Haddad, and this presentation will address the ethical considerations and welfare challenges of keeping pet reptiles. In this presentation, I'll provide an overview of the companion animal market and then discuss the major ethical considerations of the reptile pet trade, namely animal welfare, biodiversity loss, and public health and safety, and conclude with some suggested actions that may help reduce the negative impact of the pet reptile trade. This table represents the current estimated numbers of dogs and cats owned globally, including dogs, cats, and reptiles. Clearly, dogs and cats are the most favored pet, but reptiles are also becoming increasingly popular, with 9.4 million reptiles kept as pets in the United States, 9 million in Europe, and 1.2 million in the UK. And many who study the pet industry indicate that the reptile pet market is a growth industry. And the reason for this is because pet reptiles are considered kind of unique and novel and cool and rare, and it's very easy to purchase them online these days. And many social media influencers are increasing the demand for a reptile. And there's also a misconception that reptiles are somehow low maintenance and don't require the same level of care, time, or space that a dog or cat may. And while there are very different opinions about domestication, whether it is even ethical to own a dog or a cat or any other animal, global pet ownership is on the rise. But many question whether this is ethical. Francione, one of the most well-known abolitionists, equates pet ownership to slave ownership and believes animal domestication is immoral, and animals are not things to be owned, but sentient beings. But many others believe in the human-animal bond and think it's a mutually beneficial relationship. And there are several studies that document the many emotional, psychological, and physical benefits for humans and their pets. And there are also studies that suggest that pet ownership increases human compassion for all animals. And while there are differing opinions about pet ownership in general, many agree that there are some animals that are just more well-suited to be our pets than others. Dogs and cats, for example, have been domesticated over thousands of years and are far removed from their wild counterparts. And most pet owners have a very good understanding of how to meet their pets' needs. There's tons of information available online from their veterinarians, and there's many products and services out there to ensure the welfare of our dogs and cats. And while they are more suited to be pets, there are also significant welfare concerns with dogs and cats as well, such as overpopulation and puppy mills, increasing rates of surrendering of pets and high rates of euthanasia, and selective breeding for specific traits such as brachycephalic dogs and cats, despite the well-known welfare and health concerns with those specific traits. But despite these welfare issues, dogs and cats by far enjoy much higher welfare than pet reptiles. Unlike dogs and cats, reptiles are not domesticated and have only been invited into people's homes for about the last 100 years. But like dogs and cats, they are sentient, and they are capable of feeling stress, distress, excitement, fear, frustration, pain, and suffering. And they also feel pleasure, emotion, and anxiety. And whether they're wild-caught or captive bred, reptiles are widely available online, in pet stores, and at trade shows or expos. But before they reach the retail outlet, there are many welfare concerns for pet reptiles, starting with how they are sourced, whether wild-caught or captive bred, and how they are transported, stored, and cared for throughout their journey to becoming someone's pet. PETA and the Humane Society have investigated several wild-caught reptile organizations, and they've documented how these animals are roughly taken from their habitats, thrown into bags such as these ball pythons on the left waiting to be shipped off, or these turtles in overcrowded boxes that are unsanitary with no food or water. And this demonstrates just the inhumane conditions that these animals are kept in as they await transport to retail outlets. The condition that millions of reptiles endure to become someone's pet results in very high rates of mortality, up to 95% for wild-caught reptiles and 25% for captive-bred reptiles. And many estimates show that mortality rates ranging as high as 75% are considered normal for the industry and just a cost of doing business. An investigation of a large breeding facility in Texas found horrific conditions where many animals had died because they received poor care, inappropriate food, water, heat, and humidity, and these animals were crushed to death, died of dehydration, hypothermic stress, infection, parasitism, and injury. So reptiles for the pet trade, whether they are wild-caught or captive bred, suffer significant trauma and stress, which results in high rates of morbidity and mortality, which would be absolutely unacceptable for dogs or cats. And while there are knowledgeable reptile hobbyists that provide for the needs of their pets, the vast majority of pet reptiles are kept in inadequate enclosures with poor husbandry and owners who have a lack of understanding of their specific biologic needs. And it's because there are so many species, each with their own very specialized needs, that most people don't understand how to meet those needs. And there's very limited information out there that's accurate to help them figure out how to provide for what these reptiles need. And according to Warwick, who's considered one of the leading experts on reptiles, it's this lack of information that makes most reptile pet owners unprepared to provide for the specialized and unique needs of reptiles. And as a result, they suffer from poor welfare. They also don't have the benefit of regular veterinary care like our dogs and cats. And they also don't show signs of illness or disease like dogs and cats do. And many people are unable to recognize important behavioral indicators to show signs of disease, stress, and poor welfare. A recent study of reptile owners in Portugal concluded that only 15% of reptile pet owners were actually meeting the very basic needs of temperature, lighting, nutrition, and refuge. And they also believed that behaviors that were clearly indicators of stress and poor welfare were normal reptilian behaviors. Poor husbandry, such as inappropriate substrates, small or inappropriately designed enclosures, poor sanitation, poor nutrition, and failure to meet the basic light, temperature, and humidity requirements for species, can result in a wide variety of illnesses, injury, and over time death. And in fact, 70% of reptile illnesses and 20% of reptile deaths are due to poor husbandry. Warwick goes on to say that most captive reptiles suffered from drawn-out stress and morbidity and premature mortality, often dying a slow death because they're non-domesticated animals confined to diminutive enclosures wherein many, particularly snakes, will not even be able to extend their bodies to full length. And while precise numbers are elusive, many sources estimate that 75 to 90% of pet reptiles die within 1 year of being purchased. In addition to the numerous welfare issues caused by the capture, breeding, transport, storage, selling, and poor husbandry of reptiles, the pet reptile trade is also devastating to natural habitats and contributes to biodiversity loss. According to Traffic, many reptiles are sourced from the wild with little thought to the long-term impact on their population numbers. Many CITES-listed specimens are traded without licenses, and they're not reported, and many are poached from their habitats and enter illegal trade chains. The techniques used to capture wild reptiles can have a devastating impact on the environment. The use of fire, smoke, and chemicals and destructive actions can destroy the local environment. They disrupt the social structures of the animals, and many species are overcollected, preventing any sustainability of the species. And in many cases, rare and endangered reptiles and other species are caught up in the search for pet reptiles. And ranches and breeding farms are also major contributors because most of the animals there are wild-caught species. And once that breeding stock is no longer productive, they're replaced with additional wild-caught species. And many organizations feel these facilities are a clearinghouse not only for wild-caught reptiles, but also other animals of the illegal wildlife trade. And based on current estimates of reptile species and the extent of the trade, anywhere from 3,600 to 4,300 different species of reptiles are traded. And of these, 90% of the species and 50% of all individuals are wild-caught, according to several studies. And the vast majority of species are not regulated. In fact, only 9% of all reptile species are protected by CITES. The wild capture and trade of reptiles is part of the multi-billion-dollar illegal wildlife trade and is a major contributor to the biodiversity crisis. Invasive species are another way the reptile pet trade contributes to biodiversity loss. Reptiles may escape during transport or shipping, or they can be intentionally released when they're no longer wanted as a pet. And many die after being released, especially in cold climates where they freeze to death. But in the proper environment, they become established, expanding, and self-sustaining populations known as invasive species. When invasive species are established in areas they don't naturally belong in, they can cause drastic damage to the ecosystem. They compete with native animals for habitat and food and prey upon native wildlife. And they can also introduce novel diseases. Invasive alien species present one of the major threats to biodiversity. For example, South Florida, with its humid, warm climate, has many invasive species. And as of 2015, scientists at the University of Florida have identified at least 63 established species of non-native reptiles and amphibians, most of whom were former pets. Pythons, as the one shown here, are one of 5 snake species thriving in South Florida. And according to the United States Geological Service, in 2012, a study in the Everglades National Park found that since 1997, python predations devastated populations of many native wildlife species, such as raccoons, opossums, bobcats, rabbits, and foxes. And finally, the reptile pet trade poses a serious public health and safety risk. Reptiles carry many zoonotic diseases, and we know that about 75% of emerging diseases are zoonotic. There are 40 zoonotic diseases linked directly to reptiles. And we do know, unfortunately, all too well, the impact the zoonotic diseases can have when they result in pandemics, such as the current COVID-19 that we're living through now, but other conditions such as Ebola and SARS. The chronic stress of captivity that reptiles must endure causes immunosuppression, which increases the shedding of infectious organisms and increases the risk of transmission of zoonotic diseases. And many hobbyists may downplay the significance of salmonella, but reptiles and amphibians are estimated to account for 6% of all cases in the United States and Europe. And as recently as January of this year in the United States, an outbreak was linked to pet bearded dragons, which involved 44 cases, 15 hospitalizations in 25 states. And reptiles can carry a wide variety of internal and external parasites and fungal organisms that can affect both humans and livestock. And less common, but still a public safety threat, are injuries to humans. Bites, scratches, and envenomations can occur, which can be devastating and in some cases even lethal. And at the worst case, animals have killed their pets. Ball pythons have been known to kill their owners, such as this adult man on the left, and a python in the photo on the top right killed 2 young boys. So in conclusion, scientific research and data shows that reptiles are sentient animals and they have complex biologic needs that are rarely met in captivity. As pets, they suffer from poor welfare and experience a lifetime of stress and suffering with high morbidity and mortality rates. The reptile pet trade also contributes to habitat destruction and biodiversity loss, and pet reptiles pose a threat to public health and safety. Given these numerous adverse effects of the trade and the inability of most people to provide pet reptiles with what they require to have a life worth living, there can be no ethical justification for having a pet reptile. The following proposed actions may help reduce the negative impact of the reptile pet trade. 1. Increasing and strengthening CITES protection for reptiles. 2. Ban the trade in reptile species until sustainability can be demonstrated. 3. Developing identification methods to determine captive bred versus wild-caught species. And finally, embark on education campaigns for potential and current reptile pet owners, informing them that reptiles have highly specialized needs. They are not low-maintenance animals. They are very expensive. Most will die, and those that do survive will outgrow their enclosures, may outlive their owners, and when the novelty wears off or they're no longer able to care for them, there's nowhere else for them to go. Unless these or similar measures are taken, the reptile pet trade will continue to cause millions of reptiles to suffer from poor welfare, experience high morbidity and mortality rates, and contribute to the biodiversity crisis and continue to risk public health and safety. Reptiles simply should not be pets. Thank you for your time, and here are some references should you be interested in reading more about this important issue.